What if the very first lie ever planted in your life was the lie about who you are? Since childhood, you have been told you are small, limited, fragile, that your worth depends on forces outside of you, that your power must be granted by someone else, and that your destiny is shaped by systems, authorities, and conditions you were never meant to question. But what if that is exactly what they needed you to believe? What if the truth is the complete opposite? Long ago, there was a forbidden teaching so radical, so threatening to the structures of power, that it was pushed into silence, erased from memory, and buried beneath centuries of doctrine, fear, and distraction. Not because it was evil, not because it was destructive, but because it was liberating. The Gnostics called it the divine spark, a hidden fragment of infinite light buried deep within you, a living seed of the divine creator, the part of you that cannot be owned, reduced, or destroyed. They taught that awakening was not about becoming something new, but about remembering what has always been there, waiting beneath the noise. And that is why this message had to be forgotten. Because the moment a person remembers their true self, the illusion begins to crack. This is not just ancient history sealed in lost texts and erased from the past. This is happening now, inside your mind, inside your life, inside the silent place within you that still knows there is more. In this journey, we are going to uncover the lost Gnostic teaching they tried to erase, and why it may hold the missing key to your awakening, your realization, and your spiritual sovereignty. There is an ancient idea whispered through the edges of forgotten history, an idea so unsettling to systems of control that for centuries it was pushed into silence, buried beneath doctrine, erased from official memory. Wrapped in the language of heresy, it is the idea that somewhere beneath the noise of this world, beneath the roles you were taught to play and the limits you were told to accept, there is a memory inside you that was never meant to disappear. Not a belief, not a philosophy, a memory. The early mystics we now call the Gnostics spoke of this memory as something indestructible, something older than culture and deeper than identity. They believed that within every human being exists a quiet knowing, a living fragment of infinite light that cannot be destroyed even if it is forgotten. And the moment a person begins to sense that hidden presence again, something profound begins to shift. Reality itself starts to look different. The world that once seemed solid begins to reveal cracks in its surface. Patterns appear where before there was only chaos, and slowly the strange feeling begins to rise that perhaps you were never meant to be a victim of forces outside your control. Perhaps you were never meant to drift through existence, like a fragile paper boat carried by unseen tides. According to these ancient seekers, when the inner memory awakens, something remarkable happens. You no longer see yourself as a powerless fragment inside a vast, indifferent universe. You begin to experience yourself as a conscious participant in it, a co-creator within the fabric of reality itself. In their language, this hidden essence was called the divine spark. Not a symbol, not a poetic metaphor, a living connection to the source of all creation, buried deep within the human being. A key not to belief, but to realization. But if such a powerful idea existed, if human beings truly carried within them a direct link to the divine, an inner authority beyond priests, kings, or institutions, a question naturally arises. Why is this teaching almost entirely absent from the story most people know about spiritual history? Why did it vanish from the mainstream narrative? To understand that disappearance, you have to travel back nearly 2,000 years, to a time when the ancient world stood at a crossroads between emerging religious authority and a quieter current of seekers who believed something very different about the nature of the human soul. Hidden deep within the deserts of Egypt, small communities of mystics gathered in silence, people who called themselves Gnostikoi, those who know. They were not rebels in the political sense. They were not trying to overthrow empires or build competing institutions. They were seekers, individuals who sensed that the story humanity had been told about itself was incomplete. They believed there was something more to reality than what the dominant structures of belief allowed. And they believed that the path to the divine was not controlled by temples, rituals, or religious hierarchy. It was something far more intimate, far more immediate. According to their teachings, the divine was not somewhere far away in the heavens, waiting to judge humanity from a distance. The divine was already present inside the human being, hidden beneath layers of conditioning, waiting to be remembered. This idea was radically different from the emerging orthodox traditions of the time, which increasingly centered authority in institutions, doctrines, and intermediaries. The Gnostics taught something far simpler and far more dangerous to centralized power. They taught that salvation did not come from obedience to authority. It did not come from blind worship. And it certainly did not come from surrendering your spiritual agency to someone else. It came from remembering what was already within you. The divine spark, they said, was your birthright. A fragment of infinite light placed within the human being, a direct thread connecting consciousness to the original source beyond all earthly control. No priest could grant access to it, no ruler could revoke it, and no institution could stand between you and it. All that was required was remembrance. But the moment that idea began to spread, it carried with it a consequence that authorities of the ancient world immediately understood. If human beings realized that the divine already lived inside them, the entire structure of spiritual dependency would collapse. A person who remembers their inner light cannot be easily controlled. And so what began as a quiet spiritual insight soon came to be viewed as a threat. Not because it was violent, not because it was destructive, but because it was liberating. And liberation has always made systems of control nervous. Over time, the tension between these two visions of spirituality intensified. One vision said that truth flowed downward through institutions and authority. The other said that truth awakened from within the human soul. Eventually, the balance tipped. And when it did, the consequences were swift and decisive. In the year 367 CE, a powerful bishop named Athanasius of Alexandria issued a decree that would shape the future of Christianity for centuries to come. In his now famous Festal letter, he declared a fixed list of sacred texts that would be accepted as official scripture, while labeling many other spiritual writings as dangerous and forbidden. The command was clear. Writings that did not align with the newly established orthodoxy were to be destroyed. Libraries were searched. Manuscripts were burned. Teachers associated with these alternative traditions were hunted down, their voices silenced or driven into exile. In a remarkably short time, an entire body of spiritual literature began disappearing from the visible world, and with it, the teachings of the Gnostics nearly vanished from history. But history has a strange relationship with truth. Sometimes, the things most fiercely suppressed find the most unexpected ways to survive. And in this case, the survival of these teachings would depend on a desperate act of preservation that took place far from the centers of power, deep in the sands of Egypt. And so, as the decree spread and the fires of destruction moved through the ancient world, something quiet and desperate happened in the deserts of Egypt. Somewhere near a monastic community not far from the Nile, a group of unknown caretakers gathered a collection of sacred writings that had suddenly become dangerous to possess. These texts were not ordinary manuscripts. They contained teachings that spoke of direct knowledge of the divine, teachings that suggested the human soul carried within it a spark of the infinite, teachings that no longer fit within the rising structure of religious authority. Knowing the consequences of being discovered with such writings, these caretakers did something extraordinary. They sealed the manuscripts inside large clay jars and buried them beneath the sand, hiding them from the reach of power and trusting the desert itself to guard their secret. For nearly 15 centuries, the world forgot they existed. Empires rose and fell, religions expanded across continents, doctrines hardened into unquestioned traditions, and generation after generation grew up without ever hearing the quiet ideas those texts once carried. But the desert remembers what history tries to erase. In 1945, near the small Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, a farmer digging for fertilizer struck something buried beneath the earth. At first he feared the sealed jar he had uncovered might contain a spirit or a curse, an ancient superstition still alive in rural communities. Curiosity eventually won over fear. And when the jar was finally opened, what spilled out was not treasure, but something far more significant. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing more than 50 ancient texts, many of which had been lost to the world since the early centuries of Christianity. Among them were writings that scholars would later identify as the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, fragile manuscripts carrying whispers from a spiritual tradition that had nearly vanished. When researchers finally began studying these texts, they discovered something that startled historians and theologians alike. The teachings inside did not describe a simple religious system or a new set of moral rules. They described a cosmic story about consciousness itself. A story about light and shadow, freedom and limitation, knowledge and forgetfulness. According to these texts, the human experience unfolds inside a reality that is far more complex than the surface world suggests. The Gnostics spoke of unseen forces shaping the material realm, influences that operate not through physical chains, but through subtler mechanisms, confusion, distraction, fear, and the endless noise of human society. They called these forces archons, a word meaning rulers or authorities, not necessarily physical beings, but powers woven into the structure of the world itself. In their view, the material world functions almost like a veil, a system that encourages human consciousness to forget where it came from, and as long as that forgetting continues, the system remains stable. But the moment a person begins to remember the light within themselves, something in that system begins to lose its hold. The Gnostics believed that awakening to the divine spark does not destroy the world around you, but it does something just as radical. It allows you to see through the illusions that once seemed permanent. The invisible rules that shaped your perception start to dissolve. The roles you once believed defined, you begin to feel less solid. And gradually, you begin to notice patterns that were always there but hidden beneath distraction. What once appeared random begins to reveal meaning. What once felt like confinement begins to reveal pathways of freedom. It is in this sense that Gnostic teachings describe awakening not as gaining new knowledge, but as recovering something ancient that was never truly lost. And perhaps this is why these ideas were considered so unsettling to established systems of power. Because if even a small number of people rediscovered this inner authority, the entire structure of spiritual dependency would begin to shift. A person who knows their connection to the divine does not fear the same things. They do not surrender their identity so easily to external voices. They do not see themselves as powerless fragments tossed through existence. Instead, they begin to sense something far more profound. They begin to recognize that consciousness itself may be far more creative and influential than they were taught to believe. Interestingly, modern science has begun to approach similar questions from a very different direction. In fields like quantum physics and consciousness research, experiments have revealed that the observer can influence the observed, that reality may not be as fixed and objective as once assumed. Some physicists now describe the universe not as a rigid machine, but as something more fluid, shaped in subtle ways by awareness itself. The Gnostics did not speak in the language of laboratories or equations, but their ancient writings hinted at something strikingly similar. They suggested that consciousness is not merely a passive witness to reality, but an active participant in shaping it. And if that is true, then the implications are enormous. It would mean that the human mind is not merely trapped inside the world, but deeply intertwined with it. It would mean that the divine spark within you is not a poetic idea, but a living force that interacts with reality itself. And once you begin to entertain that possibility, something shifts inside your perception. You begin to look at your life differently. The problems that once seemed like absolute walls begin to look more like puzzles. The identity you inherited from society begins to feel less permanent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the quiet question begins to arise. If this spark truly exists within me, what would happen if I allowed it to awaken? The ancient texts suggest that the answer to that question changes everything. But to understand why, we need to go deeper into the story the Gnostics told about the origin of this spark and the strange cosmic drama that may have brought it into the human soul in the first place. To understand why the idea of the divine spark carried such power, the Gnostics told a story that reaches far beyond the ordinary boundaries of human history. They spoke of a time before the material universe existed, before planets, before stars, before the slow unfolding of time as we experience it. In their vision, the origin of everything was something they called the pleroma, a boundless realm of pure, luminous consciousness, a field of infinite awareness where existence was not divided into fragments, but flowed as a unified living intelligence. From this source, they said, emanations of divine presence unfolded like rays of light from a single sun. These emanations were called aeons, expressions of the infinite carrying different aspects of the same divine fullness. Among them was a presence known as Sophia, whose name means wisdom. In the poetic language of the Gnostic texts, Sophia represented the yearning of consciousness to know itself, the movement of awareness reaching outward toward creation. But somewhere in that unfolding, something unexpected occurred. According to the mythic vision preserved in those ancient writings, Sophia's longing extended beyond the harmonious balance of the pleroma. In reaching beyond the boundaries of perfect unity, something incomplete emerged. From this imbalance came a being known as the demiurge, a creator who possessed immense power but lacked full awareness of the higher realms from which existence had originally flowed. Unaware of the greater source beyond him, the demiurge began shaping the material universe, forming stars, worlds, and eventually humanity itself. Yet the Gnostics suggested that during this act of creation, something remarkable happened. In the process of forming human beings, a fragment of Sophia's original light became embedded within the human soul. A spark of the divine, hidden inside the very creatures formed by the imperfect Creator. That spark, the texts say, is the deepest core of your being. It is the part of you that sometimes feels strangely out of place in the ordinary story of the world, the part that senses there must be something more behind the surface of things. The quiet intuition that whispers, even in moments of confusion, that you are not merely a product of circumstance. The Gnostics believed that this spark carries within it the memory of its origin, a faint echo of the infinite source from which it came. But they also warned that the world shaped by the demiurge and maintained by the archons operates in a way that encourages that memory to fade, not through physical chains or visible prisons, but through subtler forces. Through endless distraction, through division and fear, through the constant noise of a world that rarely allows stillness long enough for a deeper awareness to emerge. In such an environment, the spark becomes buried beneath layers of conditioning, belief systems, emotional wounds, and cultural narratives. A person can live an entire lifetime without realizing that the most powerful part of their nature has been quietly waiting beneath the surface all along. Yet here lies the paradox at the heart of the Gnostic vision. No matter how deeply it is buried, the divine spark cannot be destroyed. It can be ignored, forgotten, or covered over, but its essence remains untouched. And the moment a person begins to remember it, even faintly, something inside them begins to reorganize. The Gnostics described awakening not as a sudden miracle imposed from outside, but as a gradual shift in perception, a turning inward, a quiet recognition that the voice you have been searching for beyond yourself has always been present within your own awareness. When that shift begins, the illusions that once seemed permanent start to loosen their grip. Fear loses some of its authority. The endless pressure to conform to roles and expectations begins to soften, and the strange feeling emerges that perhaps the story of who you are is much larger than the one you inherited. In this sense, the ancient myth of Sophia, the demiurge, and the archons is less about distant cosmic events and more about a symbolic map of inner experience. The demiurge represents the limited perspective that believes the material world is all that exists. The archons represent the forces that reinforce that belief through constant distraction and psychological conditioning. And the divine spark represents the unbreakable presence of awareness itself, the silent witness that remains even when everything else changes. When the Gnostics spoke about awakening, they were not describing an escape from the physical world, but a transformation in how you experience it. The moment you recognize the spark within you, the relationship between consciousness and reality begins to shift. You no longer experience yourself as a helpless passenger carried by unseen currents. You begin to sense that your awareness plays a role in shaping the currents themselves. Modern thinkers sometimes express a similar idea in different language, suggesting that consciousness is not merely a byproduct of the brain, but a fundamental aspect of reality. While the Gnostics lived long before such theories emerged, their writings hint at a remarkably similar intuition. They suggested that the human mind is not separate from the cosmos, but deeply woven into its fabric. If that is true, then remembering the divine spark is not simply a personal realization, it is an act that subtly reshapes the field of consciousness itself. Perhaps this is why those early mystics believed the greatest transformation does not begin with external revolution, but with inner awakening. The moment a person remembers who they truly are, the invisible structures that depend on their forgetfulness begin to weaken. And if enough individuals awaken to that memory, the collective story of humanity itself begins to change. This is why the teachings were hidden, not because they were dangerous in the violent sense, but because they invited people to reclaim a form of inner authority that cannot easily be controlled. A human being who knows their connection to the source of existence moves through the world differently. They question inherited limitations. They sense possibilities where others see barriers. They are less easily persuaded that they are small. And yet the Gnostics also understood that awakening is not automatic. The spark may be present in every person, but remembering it requires something that modern life rarely encourages: stillness, reflection, the willingness to question the stories you have always believed about yourself. In their practices, seekers turned inward through meditation, visualization, and contemplative awareness. They imagined streams of light descending from the infinite source and reconnecting with the spark in the heart. They listened to the subtle signals of dreams, believing that deeper layers of the mind still carried fragments of forgotten knowledge. They practiced silence not as an escape from the world, but as a doorway into the deeper currents of consciousness beneath it. These practices were not meant as rituals of blind worship. They were technologies of awakening, methods designed to quiet the noise of the archons and allow the inner memory to rise to the surface again. Because according to the Gnostics, salvation does not arrive from outside. It emerges from gnosis, a Greek word meaning direct knowing, not belief, not second-hand knowledge. a lived recognition of your origin beyond the limits of the material world. And once that recognition begins to take root, the old identity, built on fear and limitation, gradually dissolves. You begin to see that you were never meant to drift through existence like a powerless fragment in an indifferent universe. You were meant to participate in the unfolding of reality itself. Perhaps that is why the discovery of those buried scrolls at Nag Hammadi felt so symbolic to many who studied them. After 1,500 years hidden beneath the sand, the teachings had resurfaced just as humanity began asking deeper questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of reality. It is almost as if the ideas had been waiting patiently for the right moment to return. And in a quieter way, the same may be true for the spark within you, buried beneath distraction, waiting beneath layers of noise. The real question, then, is not whether the spark exists. The question is, what happens when you finally allow yourself to remember it? Because once that remembering begins, the world may never look quite the same again. Perhaps what matters most now is not adding anything new, but simply allowing what you have just heard to settle quietly within you. Because this journey was never really about becoming something greater than you were before. In a quieter sense, it has always been about remembering what has been present all along. Somewhere beneath the noise of expectations, beneath the roles the world asked you to play, there has always been a quiet center that never lost its connection to the source of light the Gnostics spoke of. Nothing in this story suggests that you were meant to be small or powerless or cut off from meaning. The forgetting that has shaped much of human history was never a personal failure. It was simply part of the long unfolding of consciousness moving through time, and yet even within that forgetting, the spark remained, patient, undisturbed, waiting in the background of awareness like a soft memory that never fully disappears. If something in these ideas felt strangely familiar while you listened, as if a quiet recognition stirred somewhere beneath the surface, that experience does not need to be forced into certainty or explained away. Sometimes recognition arrives slowly, like light gradually returning after a long night. The ancient seekers who carried these teachings understood that remembering is not an act of effort, but a gentle shift in awareness, a moment when the mind relaxes enough to notice what has always been there. No one moves through that process at the same pace. No one arrives early or late. Every step unfolds in its own season. And so if you find yourself here now, reflecting on these ideas, wondering about the deeper patterns of your own life, there is no need to rush toward conclusions or push the experience further than it wishes to go. The quiet presence within you has never been lost, and it has never been in danger of disappearing. It simply waits for the moments when you pause long enough to notice it again. In that sense, nothing that has happened in this exploration has been accidental. And if the story of the divine spark has stirred something within you tonight, it may simply be an invitation to keep listening as the next pieces of this ancient mystery continue to unfold. Sometimes when a story like this unfolds, it leaves behind a feeling that is difficult to explain with simple words. For me, the most striking part of these ancient Gnostic ideas is not the mystery of lost texts or the drama of hidden knowledge buried beneath centuries of history. It is the quiet possibility that something inside each of us has always been waiting patiently to be noticed, not loudly demanding attention, not forcing belief, but simply present, like a faint light behind the noise of daily life. When I reflect on the teachings about the divine spark, it does not feel like a distant myth or a theory about the past. It feels more like a mirror held gently toward the inner world, inviting each person to pause and wonder whether the sense of meaning they have been searching for might already be closer than they thought. Perhaps that is why stories like these continue to resurface across time, not because they demand agreement, but because they invite reflection. And now I find myself curious about something deeper. As you listen to this journey through forgotten teachings and hidden ideas, Did anything within you feel strangely familiar, as if a quiet part of you recognized something it had heard before? Or perhaps it raised questions you have carried for a long time, but never fully explored. If any thought, image, or feeling stayed with you while watching, I would genuinely love to hear it. You can share it in the comments, even if it is only a single line like, "Something about this feels familiar," or "This made me see things differently." Conversations like these often reveal how many people are quietly carrying the same questions. And if this reflection resonated with you, a like or subscription helps these ideas continue reaching others who may be standing at the edge of the same mystery. Thank you for spending this time exploring these ideas and supporting the channel, and for being part of a community that is willing to pause, listen, and reflect on the deeper mysteries that shape the human experience.